participants of the Election Security Conference. The e-Governance Academy is very proud to host a conference, How can governments prepare for secure elections in digital era? This event is organized in very close cooperation with State Electoral Office of Estonia, Microsoft, CybExer Technologies, and Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. And I'm very thankful for all your efforts to make this event happen. I'm very glad that the conference starting now, despite of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have participants from more than 50 countries globally, so there is a lot to share between the participants. Elections must be secure in any situation. And during the current COVID-19 pandemic, when both officials and citizens must work and participate remotely, the digital security aspects is becoming even more important. We want today to focus not only to the voting day, but more broadly consider all important security aspects across the voting process, from the information security of a political party and political groups, from the fighting with the false information to the security of vote counting environments. Also, we provide today a very practical tabletop exercise. You are invited to participate. Both e-Governance Academy and CybExer Technologies are working closely with many governments to improve their cybersecurity capacities. The conference is one important step forward in this path, and we are very happy to support you with the next steps, so feel free to contact us. Once again, many thanks to the participants, to the speakers, to our cooperation partners, and especially to our great team who make it all happen. Please enjoy the conference and make your elections safer already today.
Dear participants of the conference, the possibilities to use digital technologies widens every month, every week. The growth of these possibilities is exponential. We would not get the best out of IT solutions if we start to find means how to implement those possibilities we already have right now. We have to consider the future implementation of those solutions which are still under construction. Artificial intelligence is not present yet and does not give us advice what to do right now. So we still have to do it by us. First of all, we cannot have elections without digital technologies. They provide us huge possibilities. For example, keeping voters' registers, taking care of the principle one voter, one vote, thus avoiding double voting. Also, vote counting and tabulation, presentation of this data to the public, which does not take time. We can have, based on IT solutions, great access to statistical data on voting. We also have access to evidence on the violations based on digital technologies, as well as possibilities to study case law on complaints and appeals. We have access by digital technologies to better observation of elections, as well as share of information or information campaigns on where to vote or how the election procedures look like, as well as a larger extent of transparency of elections. We have to take note of the issues which accompany the use of digital technologies. Like opinion polls coming out very fast, campaigning is going more and more online, and also political discussions are going to the social media. What has changed over the last years is how we consume information provided by political parties and politicians. Political campaign and advertising have moved to social media, attracting the minds of differentiated target groups and spreading via these methods faster than ever. The balancing of the media and its role in general during the electoral processes is decreasing. There are different media sources, not one single or just a couple of main media outlets anymore. And now to the challenges. Conducting elections in a digital era is a constant struggle with questions about trust, disinformation, and resilience. They are all interrelated. Trust in the electoral processes is not for sure a cornerstone of democracy. In one hand, the trust can be built and maintained through electoral laws and electoral management that ensures the impartiality of election management, election administration. The trust of technology at the same time is more related to the user experience and wider public attitudes in the society towards adapting to digital transformations. Misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation is a huge threat to electoral management. Even if correct information is provided, the misinformation is still left in the internet and has its own life afterwards. It spreads very fast so that it is impossible to check the accuracy of the data before it has already reached wide public. What we can see is the role of large companies such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, or Microsoft in tackling misinformation and spread of false data is often more important than any mechanism governments in a democratic society can do. Both time-wise and based on means, how to address, how to achieve voters, how to get to voters. It has been good to see that social media platforms have started to prepare more specific tools based on clearly stated criteria to map the false facts and label them. It is clear that the intervention cannot come at the expense of freedom of expression. The transparency of the political campaign and the advertisement must be guaranteed. Member states of the European Union have started to look at the common grounds to tackle also the foreign interference during the elections, in both the member states' elections, in national elections, and also in European Parliament elections. An international level cooperation is needed not only to discuss the principles or share best practices, but also to tackle the issues of misinformation, which isn't mostly country-specific. One of the key questions is how to keep the society in one single space of information. The trust in the electoral processes can be achieved by reducing the level of criticism towards the functioning of the whole governmental system. Governments have to cooperate and to cooperate with large private companies. What we can do in order to keep the trust in the electoral processes and in the independent media is the transparency of campaign financing and campaigning itself. Who is the person or political group behind the campaign activity? All of us, the voters, have to access to more transparency on who's campaigning, who's using his or her freedom of speech, as well as whether the election management bodies are impartial. Is the media politically neutral or biased? And on the other hand, we have to balance the freedom of speech, right to receive information, and electoral right with the requirement of free and equal voting rights, requesting transparency in party and campaign financing, and pointing out the real persons or political parties behind the sharing of misinformation or false data. This comes in addition to setting limits to the campaign costs. Now, concerning the cyber attacks, we have to discuss also the role of the government. These issues are not election-specific, and there is a great need to deal with them in relation to any public duties and tasks. But if the government aims to discredit the elections, even if the cyber attack comes from an unidentified source or a foreign country, the aim of the government may be to postpone elections, not to find a solution as soon as possible. danger may be a good argument to base one's campaigning, especially by the leading parties if they prefer the wider restriction of fundamental rights. Trust to electoral organizers and the electoral system is the key to ensure participation and thus the legitimacy of the governance. Free and fair political debate, where using the false information is condemned, is the basis to maintain the trust and increase the cohesion of society. But that alone is not enough. The tools to conduct elections, electoral information systems and procedures must be resilient to different threats. We have to guarantee the existence of consistent and necessary funding for the elections and the cooperation between different agencies in conducting elections. It is crucial to have risk management plans in place and to play through different threat scenarios. Free elections cannot be held without the stability and effectiveness of the procedures. When talking about the resources to counter the attacks and to address the dangers, we understand mainly the financing, but there are others too, such as legal means in the election code. Last-minute amendments to the election law discredits the whole procedure. The election management bodies have to be trained based on the current legislation. There should be clear tasks for all state institutions who have to take care of the procedures. We have to have means to tackle the problems concerning the misuse of administrative resources or hidden financing of political campaigns. This means human resources for the central election commissions and other bodies with a task to control political party financing. Risk management plans need time to be developed and implemented. There are different ways to maintain and increase the resistance to threats created by the disinformation campaign or attacks on electoral information systems. Now, as a last point, I would point out that internet voting applied in Estonia since 2005 has gained popularity steadily. And at the last election in 2019, it was the most common way of voting, even surpassing the traditional paper-based ballots. It is related to the convenience of the voters and general trust to state digital services. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great couple of hours in this conference.
Hi, welcome everybody to our conference and tabletop exercise. My name is Merle Maigre and I'm from the e-Governance Academy. First, I'd like to say big thanks to Hannes Astok and Oliver Kask for the inspiring words and for the deep points directing us to the panel discussions. We are here today to discuss about elections, which touch upon a core moment in a citizen's life in a democratic society. Voting goes to the heart of democracy. Elections can be on paper, they can be digital or electronic, but the question is, how can we make sure that they are secure, especially in the digital age? So today, we will have two panel discussions on this issue, followed by a tabletop exercise on CybExer Technologies platform called CybExer Technology Strategic Exercises platform called Stratex. But before we start with the discussions, let me introduce you to today's event environment. We are using an event platform called Worksup, where you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button under each discussion. If you do not have a question to ask, you can upvote other people's questions. The ones that get most upvoted have the highest chance of being asked, so be sure to do that. But now, let's start with our first discussion today titled What Scope, What Responsibilities, where I will be joined with the former president of Estonia, Hendrik Ilves, Director of International Policy at Cyber Policy Center in Stanford University, Marietje Schaake, and last but not least, the head of cybersecurity business development at Cybernetica, Liisa Past. So hello and welcome to the first panel. I would first like to pass the word to President Ilves, and I would like to ask you, how would you scope the problem of securing elections in a digital era? How do you think democracies can work better together to address election interference? And last but not least, how do you think we could close the transatlantic rift in protecting liberal democracies? Please.
You want me to do that in 7 minutes? Well, first of all, let me start saying that we can only really talk about election interference when you're dealing with democracies. And it's also not just about elections. The whole point of interference is to achieve a political effect. As von Clausewitz says, war is the continuation of policy by other means. And when you are the adversary of a democracy, you say, oh, well, here's something where you can continue war by other means. Before you had democracies, obviously, you didn't affect elections. And so this leads to a unique situation, which is that any kind of attempts to manipulate democracy is, first of all, asymmetric. That is to say, you can't, they can do it to you, you can't do it to them. And then the problem of reciprocity or reciprocal response is highly problematic, since what is it that you can do if someone attacks your democracy? And so basically, if you can't do election interference to an undemocratic adversary, I mean, let's be honest, what are you going to do to change the results in any way, possible way, in either Russia or Belarus or any of the other autocratic, non-democratic regimes that democracy deals with? One of the things we have to realize is that the spectrum of activity is amazingly wide when it comes to what we call election interference. I would prefer to call it democracy interference, because you don't have to just go after elections. And in fact, when we look at the influence operations that we've seen, I mean, they are year-round perhaps with the goal of changing the results of an election, which would then lead to a change in policy. But when we talk about election interference, people still tend to think of what it is that you do on or around election day, not that it is a constant, persistent activity that is year-round. Now, if we look at the use of, if we look at interference in democratic elections, it has a long history that goes back, I mean, I guess in a major way back to 100 years ago, when we started to see attempts to affect elections by the Bolsheviks. And I mean, some people claim even earlier, but in any case, but all of this was limited by technology. That, I mean, you did not have wide distribution networks. You couldn't get to people really. I mean, I remember 40 years ago, there would be some guy in a street corner at Columbia University selling the Daily Worker, which no one ever bought. It wasn't very effective, obviously. And if you look historically at the attempts of disinformation. Really, the classic case is in 1985 or so, the Soviets tried to start a rumor in a provincial communist newspaper in India that the CIA invented AIDS, which then over a series of months made it to Germany and was finally was laundered into the mainstream press there. Now, you don't have to do that anymore. Today, all of you can not only do mass distribution of fake stories and disinformation, you can also do micro-targeting. And we saw in the case already of the 2016 election in the United States, but even earlier, I think, and maybe Marietje can talk about it, with the association agreement for Ukraine in 2015, certainly we saw various kinds of misinformation, disinformation, information laundering, and also on a targeted basis already in the Brexit election. So this has become part of our political reality, and one that we have to deal with. Now that's one kind of election interference. When we talk about election interference, however, it goes all the way to the other end of a broad spectrum, which at its most specific actually involves manipulating the numbers, hacking the numbers that go into, that ultimately are tabulated for votes. And we have seen attempts even at that. And so as a result, we have people in the past several years saying, oh, we must do paper balloting, and paper ballots are the only way to have secure elections. I wish that were true, because first of all, you're not even taking into account the digital social media environment that we're talking about. But even when it comes to elections today, or when we do elections today, we naively think that voting digitally means that you, in the case of the United States, there's a voting machine that you press a button on, or in the case of Estonia, we have a very secure system that you use to vote over the internet. But in fact, since the computerization of the electoral process beginning already in the 1980s, from the very beginning, which is the voter list, though that is kind of a unique problem of the United States, that they have something that you have to register to vote. Voting should be a right for all citizens, and the idea of if you're a citizen, you should have the right to vote. But in the United States, you have voter registration. We already know that at least, depending on who you ask, in 2016, either 21 or 39 states had their voting lists breached in the United States. The 39 number comes from was a secret report from the NSA, for which a person went to jail. But we don't know, based on what was released, whether anyone affected voting rolls. But even there, you can already manipulate an election. If you start changing or removing names, people then cannot vote. And then so that's already one end of the spectrum. On the other end, skipping over the actual voting, the entire tabulation and adding up results from precincts to districts to up to the final results in an election, that too can be manipulated digitally by simply hacking into it. So what we'll be spending, I guess, a lot of time today on is using digital means in elections, but in fact, we forget in all of our discussions how vulnerable the entire process can be without truly secure systems that are both in terms of software and hardware. And I've heard various people over the years talk about, oh, well, how do you do this? How do you have secure elections? Someone could change your vote, when in fact there's so much you can change in the electoral process, and we are not going to go away from using digital and electronic means. That I think we should turn the focus of our electoral security in the case of the actual voting process far more to hardening the systems with two-factor authentication and with end-to-end encryption and other things like that people don't think about at all, using distributed ledgers, also known as blockchain, to guarantee data integrity, which has not been used very much. All of these methods are there to guarantee electoral integrity, but we should stop talking about, oh my God, we have to use paper ballots. We have disinformation, targeted disinformation. We have attacks on the actual integrity of the electoral system, all of which is possible. That was my timer. All of which is possible only because of the digital era. And then we have finally, which I didn't get into, but more traditionally means that you can simply buy votes, buy candidates. These are all ways to go back to von Clausewitz, to affect policy by other means. And that's what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Ilves. Marietje, you have been dealing and thinking about election security, both in your time in the European Parliament as well as now from the Stanford University. What do you think, what is the role of the government, the political parties, and also individual politicians in taking responsibility about issues such as defining elections as a critical infrastructure, in transparency, in party financing, and political advertising? And also, what do you think is the responsibility of the private sector, of the big tech companies vis-à-vis fighting disinformation? Are they doing enough or not? Please.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to join you for this really important discussion. I think we've seen some real-time playing out of risk and the impact of an erosion of trust in the electoral process. And it's still ongoing in the United States. And so I think every government, every society cannot be early enough in trying to make sure that there is trust and resiliency in their systems. So the way I like to think about roles and responsibilities when it comes to maintaining trust and security in the democratic process is as an ecosystem. So I believe that there are indeed a number of technical and cybersecurity aspects, but that there's an entire spectrum then that links together the platforms where the public debate and the political debate take place, the different actors that are involved, as you mentioned, whether they are in government, in the private sector, or in political parties, in the media, in society at large. And so one of the important challenges, I think, is to see the tension between these cybersecurity aspects and the debate itself. I was reading up on the latest that happened overnight in the United States this morning, and noticed that Chris Krebs, who has just been fired from the US government for pushing back against deliberate disinformation about the electoral process, while his office and team and he himself were responsible for securing, from a cybersecurity point of view, the elections, and do not feel that any of the claims of disinformation are substantiated. And so there is a real clash between, on the one hand, the cybersecurity actors taking their responsibility, and then the disinformation, which, contrary to 2016, is not coming necessarily from foreign actors, is not easily labeled as foreign meddling, but is coming from within. And not just from within American society, but from the very highest office in American politics. And so I think it's important to make a stronger connection and to look into the interaction between those technical questions, which were often seen as the domain of experts, the domain of intelligence services, certs, cybersecurity experts, but not so much for all of society, simply because not every person has the agency to be responsible to secure an election as such. It does require that expertise, that mandate to take such important actions. But a number of those are limited in their trust-building effect when concerted disinformation campaigns continue to attack the trust in liberal democracy in a way that at the end of the day may continue to have effect, even if there is no reason for mistrust. So what this American example shows is how this is a dynamic field. Lessons learned from 2016 did not apply one-on-one to 2020. And I'm sure a lot of new insights will still have to be glanced from what has happened in this year and what continues to happen, whether it's disinformation campaigns against Hispanics in Florida and other states, whether it is the appearance of ghost candidates on ballot papers in Florida to divide, for example, the Democratic vote to advantage the positions of Republican candidates. There's a lot that still needs to be uncovered, and unfortunately this independent research, and I hear a lot of complaints about this from my colleagues at Stanford, independent research, so insight and oversight, are not helped by a lack of transparency provided by the big tech companies. You asked about the role of companies, and I think that simply being the platform, creating the conditions for access to information, a public debate, who gets to pay for play when it comes to pushing their messages, how easily can they be manipulated, are all areas that really require deeper research in the public interest. The fact that we don't know more about cause and effect, about information online and behavior offline, is actually harmful for the public interest and democracy as such. The fact that commercial and advertising companies play such an outsized role in our political and public debate, I believe, deserves more scrutiny. And so what you see in all of these examples is that safeguarding these processes, having rules in place that President Ilves also mentioned, whether it's campaign financing, whether it's transparency and accountability, whether it is cybersecurity, stress testing, commitments to not using certain tactics. It is much better to have these rules and standards in place in a non-partisan way before the polarization gets too deep, before the erosion of trust has already happened as a result of disinformation, because illustrated over and over again, and I think most tellingly in the United States, once this deep polarization and erosion of trust takes hold, it's not only harder to convince people how important this is and that it's not a weapon against the success of one party or another to put in place stronger protections of the democratic process. But now, politically, it will become harder because everything is seen through the lens of the success of one side over the failure of the other side, even though obviously all citizens and all parties should have a high stake in protecting the elections, both from attacks from the outside, from commercial models pushing against democratic principles, or the erosion from within. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer more questions, and thanks for having me this morning.
Much for adding your deep thoughts in this and for elaborating indeed on the role of big companies. Building on that and building on what you mentioned, how important the role of technology is, Liisa, can you expand a little bit more on these issues? What do you think is the role of technology in elections? And perhaps could you walk us through the different stages in electoral procedures? And last but not least, what and whose responsibility is it, to your mind, to do a comprehensive risk assessment of elections?
Thank you. And I couldn't have a better setup to talk about comprehensive risk and what comprehensive risk assessment looks like, both in terms of technology and the overall elections ecosystem, than the two previous speakers. Now, as everyone so far has emphasized, this is about free, fair and open elections based on the one person, one vote principle, regardless of the way you vote, regardless of the way you tally votes, and regardless of the way the election organizer publishes and broadcasts the result of the votes. And we're dealing with it at a time where the public square, the central idea, the marketplace of ideas, the central idea of a democratic system, particularly in the US, that's very debates and local gatherings and big rallies based, is impossible, or at least you have to pick between democracy and public health, a choice that you don't easily want to make. Similarly, since arguably 100 years ago, but definitely since the events in Ukraine in 2014 and the presidential campaigns in France and the United States in 2016, we know that it's an adversary that's reactive and opportunistic, that's looking to delegitimize any part of the election life cycle rather than to, corrupt the integrity of a single vote or corrupt the integrity of a single part of the system. It's about creating doubt, confusion, and alienating thus the voters from their democracy and creating the sense of, well, it's all dirty, so why do I bother? And we've seen a live demonstration of that in the last 5 or 6 years. So elections across the world, and even in various US states, are incredibly varied, and they rely on digital technology in various parts of the election life cycle. And it's important to know and notice that no particular technology, after all, pen and paper is a form of analog technology, is more or less secure than the other inherently. But it's rather about how you manage it and how you deploy it. So, as some election managers have found out, introducing electronic voter lists that don't in real time or close to real time check voter eligibility is a really bad idea. However, introducing electronic voter lists that do cross-reference with voter eligibility and with population registry data is a really good idea. So it's about how you check and balance technology. And it's about introducing technology where it most helps to avoid risks. Now, when you introduce any technology, do you log network traffic? Do you log every step of the process? Do you have proper access control? We know that in the physical world, we're pretty good about perimeter control. We tape and seal the ballot box. We have understanding of what the voting booth looks like. We know what the polling station looks like. But then how do you make sure that the same constitutional principles of free, fair, open elections that are in some way transparent and or observable, and where double voting or triple voting is avoided, so one person, one vote principle is preserved, how do you transit to that becomes the central question. And the way an election organizer should think about risk management, therefore, is to start with keeping the house in order and then moving outwards. I think of it as concentric circles, where the first central element of election integrity in any way of voting in a democracy, the caveat of President Ilves is ever so important here, is making sure that both the voters' political will is accurately recorded and that they believe that it's accurately recorded. So it's both the action and the what it looks like. And whether you do that using pen and paper and the ballot box, then it's observable for the person that they placed their vote in a ballot box. Whether you do it in postal voting, as a large part of the world does, again, how do you ensure secrecy of the vote whilst also ensuring reasonable traceability and observability? Do you treat the postal system as a black box, or do you scan the outer envelope? When you have a double envelope ensuring the secrecy of the vote, do you scan the outer envelope at different stages of the postal delivery process, as a large part of the US election organizers now do? Again, how would you introduce technology in a way that enhances security rather than risks it? So once the voting process has been secured, the next stage of risk management is that of election technology. Technology specific to election, but not to do with necessarily the process of casting the vote themselves. No, that might be a comprehensive election information system of the kind that both Estonia and, for example, Finland uses, where every stage of the election life cycle, from the registration of candidates, the voter list, through to publication of results, is in a singular information system that's been developed for that custom purpose, to specific applications, be it electronic poll books for voter lists or something else. And only when voting itself has been taken care of can you start to manage risks in the wider sort of election technology ecosystem, taking care that the constitutional requirements on elections are continuously fulfilled. Now, using the specific electronic opportunities to do so. I mentioned logging, I mentioned network segmentation, things that enhance security rather than risk it. Then the third element, and that's where we've seen most breaches and most attempts to attack elections, is the facilitators. That technology that facilitates participation in democracy and elections, whether it's the websites of parties and candidates, whether it's how we converse, and also I would include media in that. And I think that's where, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we need to see most development, not just in terms of risk management and security, but also development of technology. We know that during pandemic and quite possibly post-pandemic, the public square that I mentioned, the way we discuss in a democracy might not be possible ever again in quite the same way. Not everyone, not every citizen will feel comfortable coming together in these many-to-many conversations that are so central to Western democracies. So whilst the one-to-many, the broadcast model, has good technical solutions, whether it's cable news, whether it's something along the lines of what we're doing today, whether it's online videos, there's good solutions for that. The many-to-many conversations that are central to our understanding of politics in a democratic governance need to be figured out. Which leads me to the fourth and final level of managing risks, which is that of the information environment. Both Marietje and Toomas, Hendrik mentioned many of the challenges, and it truly is an integrity challenge. How do we make sure that citizens trust democratic governance? How do we make sure that they're critical readers and critical writers also of their own texts? Because in the end, elections are fundamentally about delegating trust. It's delegating trust in the fundamental way of delegating your part in governance to a candidate that hopefully goes on to win the elections and be elected to their desired office. But also the processes are about delegating trust on a fundamental level in electoral proceedings, we delegate trust to the elections organizers, and on the very top level to Judge Kask, who's in the audience today and who offered his opening remarks. And countries have had centuries in the luckier cases and decades in the less lucky cases, such as us in Estonia, to practice delegating trust face-to-face, paper-to-paper. And it's hard conceptually to delegate trust to complex mathematics, particularly since we live in a world where mathematics are unnecessarily over-mystified starting in elementary school. So for many people, trust me, I'm government is easier in terms of the cognitive process than trust me, I'm complex mathematics. And that's to what we're delegating part of trust in election technology, regardless of where technology is deployed. And at the time where technology will need to continue to be deployed safely, particularly in balancing democracy and public health.
Thank you, Liisa. Absolutely, I can't agree more. But building on this, I'd like to warm up for the whole panel for the discussion. Ask you all, and then go to the more deeper Q&A that the audience has been providing us. And thank you for that, and thank you for voting in various questions. So this webinar takes place in a wake of the US presidential election, which is an election where the voter and the electoral officials have been challenged by a global pandemics, as well as systematic voter suppression and lack of trust in electoral process, just as you, Liisa, mentioned. What do you think, how to balance between election and public health? Is internet voting the solution in this, or is it complicating things and bearing the trust very thin? President Ilves, would you like to start us off in that? I think you're muted. I can't hear you. I hope others, I suspect. Yeah. Yes, now it's better.
All right. Let me just say a few quick things, because I want to release a question for Q&A. First of all, I think the US is almost a special case. And we forget, first of all, the disinformation and disruption of democratic processes, including elections, takes place all over the democratic world, but because the United States outsized power and place in society, everyone focuses on the US election. Secondly, I would say that the US has one of the worst electoral systems anywhere in the world. It is stuck in the pre-modern first past the post system, which is a distortion of democracy, and which we have seen in its worst cases in the 20 years, twice, when in fact the popular vote ran against the electoral college vote, which is disproportional and first past the post. When it comes to doing elections digitally, which is a very good idea in an era of COVID or whatever else comes in the future, I think Liisa has made this point over the years, over and over, that it works, but it has to work in a larger ecological ecosystem in which you actually use the same digital tools for all kinds of interactions. And in fact, in Estonia, all but 3 interactions involving the government can be done online. And especially, if you've been doing all your bank transactions using the same end-to-end encryption, 2-factor authentication system, and do it daily or weekly, then voting is not something that instills fear. Whereas if you have a specific system used only once every 2.5 years, or 3 times within 5 years, as most elections are in Europe, you're not going to trust it. So the trust part requires actually digitization of everything else, not digitization of the electoral system. And finally, when it comes to electoral integrity, You can, of course, maybe find someday cases in which it's been abused digitally. But compared to all of the votes bought with money, the old Chicago vote early and often, which is an expression that's over 100 years old. And finally, I mean, in my country, we even had people buying votes in a traditional setting for a bottle of vodka. So I think that we can kind of tone down the fear about the digital side, where I think we're far more adept and capable of finding electoral irregularities than we are with the people who are voting for parties that are against digital elections.
Thanks. Marietje, would you like to add at this point, or shall we just go on with other questions?
Well, maybe just a brief remark that I agree that the difference in the systems of organizing elections are very, very important to even assess the viability of digitizing the voting process. So in the United States, it's highly decentralized with about 10,000 different districts that organize the process in their own way with legacy technologies and no real ability to streamline or standardize so far. And I would only imagine that doing such an effort now is hard because of the political polarization. And the question of trust is resting on many more aspects than just the democratic process. So the country I know best, the Netherlands, we vote with a red pencil and a piece of paper. But of course, at the end of the day, the votes tallied and aggregated end up in some automated or digital form in an Excel spreadsheet or on a website. And all of that is trusted because there's general trust in society, which is built, by many different steps and actors and legal provisions. So generally, I would say what's much more important is to have a verifiable voting process. And whether it's digital or analog doesn't matter as much, but it seems to me that technology normally cannot, in and of itself, replace the lack of trust in democracy or democratic process. So we cannot expect magical improvements of trust by just changing it into an online or digital voting process.
Thank you. And I'd like to also thank everybody who's been watching us on Workshop and asking questions there and voting for their questions. So in an attempt to expand this discussion a little bit beyond the US elections, I'd like to encourage people who are watching us to ask and participate in this discussion. I'll read out the first question and I'd ask you, Liisa, to take the first look at it. So our audience would like to ask a question about blockchain elections. Could you tell us, is it possible to organize blockchain elections in developing countries? A little bit, this is a continuation somewhat of the same debate, but still takes it further.
So distributed ledger is one of the ghosts that haunts information security from all corners and aspects since blockchain became hype a while ago. And distributed ledger is great, as President Ilves pointed out, in ensuring information or data integrity in systems where no central authority of trust exists. However, elections rely on a central election authority in most cases. So in terms of the fundamental organization of elections, distributed ledger blockchain technology currently would have rather limited uses in integrity, and of course in integrity of the wider information ecosystem. There's a lot more uses, but it's really appropriate where there's questions of central trust, whether it's in transitional times or whether it's in non-binding, non-central, non-national elections. And it might also have uses in verification. Marietje mentioned verification just now, where verification or verifiability of election isn't one smooth silver bullet process, but it's rather a coming together of two opposite ends of a process where there's the personal verification. Now, the moment I drop my ballot into a ballot box, I can no longer personally verify it. Similarly, I can only digitally verify that my vote has been passed to the second stage. But without breaching vote secrecy, I can't verify that it's been counted accurately, which is where what we call universal verifiability comes in. And again, there's particular distributed ledger solutions there for vote verification.
Thanks. President Ilves, you wanted to comment on this as well.
I want to say that, well, we shouldn't get into a technical argument here, but I would say that a permissioned ledger with a limited number of authorities, it is not a decentralized system. I would say that I view it as supply chain integrity maintenance rather than, you don't vote on blockchain. That's not the whole, I mean, I don't know who asked the question, but you don't vote on blockchain. It is that you can use distributed ledger systems to do the same kind of supply chain integrity control as you do in, say, buying or getting vaccine for COVID, which is you have to make sure that in no step of the process was there for any kind of interference. But you don't vote on blockchain. You vote as you vote, but you can use distributed ledger, a permission distributed ledger that is with a limited number of authorities, not everybody doing it like in Bitcoin, but rather a limited number. Election authority can, in fact, be the ones that control and check up on the integrity of the entire voting chain, beginning from voting lists to the final tabulation.
Thanks. We have a passionate discussion on the Q&A regarding not just the US elections and blockchain, but also about the debate going on about trust in elections here in Estonia. So I will take a number of questions that address the same issue, and I'd like you to comment on those. And sorry, Marietje, about these questions being Estonia specific. However, I think that there are some general issues hidden there in this debate that go beyond Estonia. So I'll read out some of the questions. After the last Estonian parliamentary elections, one of the winning party, Conservative People's Party, became critical of e-voting and its cybersecurity issues. Later, the party minister gathered an e-election task force group, and one of their proposals was that more resources should be made available so that several independent auditors can check the process of e-voting. Now comes the question, in your opinion, are these kinds of thorough audits raising trust, especially in case of one political party that has suspicion towards the specific voting channel, internet? A more general question on the same issue, how has Estonia managed to maintain trust in elections during the ID card problem? And a question also about the Estonian iVoting system is generally seen as secure, but is not understood very well by the population that uses it. How can we communicate the functioning of the system more usefully so that people can trust it? So, bunch of questions, not easy. Lisa, would you try to sort of like tackle some of them?
I'll give it a stab, and I think they're not as Estonia specific as they sound. Here around this virtual discussion table, we have the most and least digital of European elections, Estonia and the Netherlands. Ironically, and I think the issue of trust is very much, the mechanisms of trust are very much the same. First of all, it is about technical communication and legal communication. A lot of election procedures are legal procedures that sound quite technical regardless of what their domain is. And there's a fundamental question of how the lawyers having learned to communicate in an understandable way. The technologists need to do the same. And frankly, the technologists also need to take another step and take their knowledge into legal education. We have an Estonian court ruling that in its oversimplified way says, listen, you need to make this more understandable to lawyers, and that goes to iVoting. Then on the audit and testing, the auditing of election results is fundamental in systems such as the US, where not all votes get double count. In Estonia, paper votes are counted twice, by hand, and then, because we have a very simple ballot. And digital votes are tabulated twice also on 2 consecutive days. So I think the audit and testing question is right, but I think it also needs to happen earlier. Independent audit of the code base of the software in election technology is more valuable than auditing the results. Testing and independent testing, again, of the technology, both in terms of functional testing, does it do what it's supposed to do, and also non-functional testing, so security testing and penetration testing, the different elements, is more important, because that way we'll catch issues before they happen. And my Finnish colleagues, if you allow me a very brief promotional break, wrote an excellent contribution into the European Union Compendium on Election Security, on testing and how to think structurally about testing election technology. And finally, on the ID card issue, I think the main lesson was of aggressive transparency there. For those who are not familiar with the case, Estonia got notification less than 2 months before elections, local elections in 2017. It's one of my war stories, so it feels like yesterday, of a vulnerability in the crypto library of the firmware of the ID card. So something that we couldn't technically mitigate, but had to find a way around of the vulnerability in a fundamental facilitator of the ecosystem. And it's really a case where I was at the time Chief Research Officer at the Information System Authority. We went to the Election Commission within a few working days of going public and finding out. And we said, listen, there's a risk. At this point, it's a race of timelines, and we can't quantify the likelihood of us having a fix before there being an exploit that could bring down the ecosystem. We're working on it, and currently it's a theoretical, mathematical, hypothetical, cryptographical risk, using all of those words. And we went in, frankly, thinking that we'll come out with internet voting being cancelled, because that's our job as risk managers was to try to understand the possible detrimental effect of the risk. And that's where the distribution of roles in norm and in law kicked in, because at the time the chairman of the National Elections Commission looked at us and said, I understand what you're saying, but we're lawyers and we don't deal in the hypotheticals. And said that very publicly and very transparently. Come back when there is an incident, come back when you can quantify the risk. And that's a great case study of the different roles to check each other, kicking in the way they're intended to.
Thank you, Liisa. Marietje, sorry, yeah.
I mean, two things I want to say, just so people know that what is being referred to was, to be very blunt, it was a flaw that was in the chip by the chip maker, who did not inform the country. So this has nothing to do with the electoral system. It is a flaw in the chip that also is used in the highest level credit cards. So this was a chip flaw. The other thing on the question of the populist party, this is a far right party. We're not dealing with a party that you normally find in democracies. Everyone, they don't know what digital voting is about, except for the one minister who got fired who was part of this government coalition, who just published an article saying that digital voting works. So what we do have is people who do not understand tech at all, making a populist point and dragging down the reputation of our electoral system for their populist points, but who could not even know nothing about digital affairs except for the one person in the party coalition that does, who said that electoral voting works fine. So I don't think we should even take anything they say seriously anymore, given the level of non-expertise that I hear from those people. Pardon me for the partisan intervention, but I really dislike ignorance.
Fair enough. Marietje, is there anything you would like to comment on these issues? I mean, don't feel as if we are trying to drag you into the domestic political issue, but I think trust that is being touched here, and the issue of explaining complicated things to people so that the trust from the electoral process doesn't erode, is something that is not, as Liisa very correctly said, not just specific to Estonia, but characteristic to all the countries, and the need to be transparent about issues, about risks, and yet the need to take bold decisions at critical times is something that politicians, statesmen, and all of us at the end of the day need to do all. Let's continue with the questions. The main questions on the Q&A session here, yes, touched about Estonia. There's one which is more technical. During the physical elections, you can see voter alone in the voting booth. How can you ensure that during an electronic election via internet, how do we ensure that the vote is personal? Liisa.
That question is right on, because in remote voting, whether it's by mail, electronic or otherwise, you have less control of the environment. So you need to mitigate for that using other means. There isn't a good mitigation in postal voting that I know anywhere in the world. And what Estonia has done for the remote electronic voting, so for internet voting, is to de-incentivize and demotivate those trying to coerce the voter or to buy votes by allowing the voter to cast their vote as however many times with only the last vote counting, meaning that there's no longer sense in coercing them or in influencing them, since they can go back and the moment the person influencing them has left, recast their vote. And they can also recast it in early voting on paper, and then the paper takes priority over the digital. So Estonia in digital voting has mitigated that exact question, the lack of controlled environment, by allowing multiple voting where only last vote counts.
Thank you. We don't have much time left, but there is enough for one remaining question and a sort of like final remarks or thoughts you would like to leave the audience with. We've been discussing a lot about how the various national issue of elections and political elections indeed are deeply national issue. But how much room is there for cooperation and multinational efforts? Marietje, back in December 2018, I believe, you wrote about the need for EU to have election meddling stress tests to measure the security and resilience on election infrastructure and technologies. Do you think this is still relevant at the European level? And Liisa, I recall back, you mentioned casually, but I think this deserves still advertisement, the effort that you led back in 2018, the endeavor to gather best practices from 20 plus EU countries on cybersecurity of election technology, this compendium. Although 2 years old, I think it still is interesting and relevant. Is there a follow-up, or where do you think, all of you, where do you think EU is today with election resilience at this multinational efforts level? Marietje.
Yeah, so I think we see over and over again that democracy is only as strong as its weakest link. And in the EU, unfortunately, we have plenty of examples where once a less democratic or explicitly illiberal democratic, to the extent that that's a concept at all, but illiberal government comes in, it pulls down the democratic ability and credibility of the whole union. And the same can be said for the United States. You know, if one state or district can successfully be flipped, it can have a ripple effect throughout the entire United States. And so, of course, it is important to have a minimum standard across the European Union, and also the ability to not only trust but verify. And therefore, I think stress tests and having minimum benchmarks and an ability to transparently, as you mentioned previously, be aware and on that basis inform citizens of how the systems work to advance their rights, not to forget, I believe is crucial. So yes, I don't think that the EU is where it should be yet in order to ensure democratic resilience. And the same goes for fighting back against disinformation and other malign campaigns, including through the business models of the big tech corporations. So this is a work in progress that probably never ends. And maybe that's also something people should be aware of, that making sure that the democratic process is not undermined is something that requires work, and we can never sit back and expect that things will be fine if we don't defend our principles.
Thank you. Liisa.
There's, the minimum effort, and that's being done, is to update the best practice and to share the best practice. However, actual operational security of elections and information sharing around that is where Europe can really learn from the United States, whether it's through the learning and scaling for Europe, the efforts of Chris Krebs' team at Department of Homeland Security, or whether it's the work of Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center run by the Center for Internet Security, that are fundamentally focused on actionable, operational, real-time or close to real-time advice. So that you don't all make the same mistakes at once. And if not before, then in the next European Parliament elections in less than 4 years. That's when Europe has such a unique opportunity to build up, having close to 30 elections nationally in less than a week is when you can come together and build up that real-time or close to real-time alert information sharing and actionable alert clearinghouse. I think that's, if we fail at that, why do we even bother?
Thank you. President Ilves, do you have last thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
Well, briefly, I think that what we do need to do is, which I didn't raise before, but I'll just say, given that at least in terms of external actors manipulating elections, it's a limited number of entities doing this. I mean, they call them what you want, but APT 28, APT 29, the IRA in Petersburg, the so-called Internet Research Agency, and they have been active in different ways in virtually every liberal democracy in Europe and North America. Unless we start cooperating far more between nations and among nations, we will, all of us, be more or less alone dealing with this. I find it sad and disappointing that the European Union and also NATO have not really addressed these issues more seriously, appealing to mandate restrictions. And I know in the case of especially NATO that, we can study this if it's attacking NATO, but if it's they're attacking someone else, we can't. So we're wasting resources and we're not cooperating enough. And since what we share is democracy, what they share are a limited number of actors destroying democracy. The liberal democracies in Europe and in North America should be cooperating far, far, far more on dealing with these, be it the attacks on the integrity of the digital system or the attacks that we see through disinformation. Without far closer cooperation between and among nations, we will be, as it were, hanging separately.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very thought-invigorating discussion. I would like to really thank my panel in this and remind us all that while we are warmed up in discussion, don't leave the screens yet, as we have a second panel to follow, moderated by Professor Robert Krimmer, Professor of E-Governance at the Tartu University. So thank you. I think what we've learned and realized is that when it comes to elections and political participation, elections represent something that countries have in common, yet it also differentiates the countries because the way the elections are being organized are different in each country. Yet again, there is need to do more together. Thank you.
Welcome everybody to our second discussion, where we will also try to give a bit of an international experience and connecting that with the Estonian particular experience on having such a plethora of convenience voting mechanisms, including being the only country offering internet voting with all of its elections without any restrictions. I have the honor that I will have two great speakers with me. On the one hand side, Marina Kaljurand and Jan Neutze, who I will introduce in a little bit in more detail. Before that, I will just want to give you this quick intro from my side in terms of how I see what we need to protect, right? So when we talk about elections, it is important to understand that it's actually a very special social process that actually is culminating of over a year-long process in one single day. And that day is kind of like the celebration of democracy that allows us to actually see what are the different opinions, what are the different options that we have. And going towards this day is actually the first step that we have to secure, and that is the campaigning. And that has come under threat more than we even ever anticipated in the most recent years, not so much due to opinions that are being raised, but actually on how the voters are being channeled towards those opinions and whether we can trust them, right? And here technology has played a crucial role with what started originally as, in a positive sense, one-on-one marketing. We had early startups in the 2000s called Razorfish and other innovative companies, but that has turned today in this what we can call fake news, filter bubbles, and the problem that people that might have a certain preference for certain political areas can be targeted very clearly with not correct information, and it becomes very difficult to actually provide unbiased information to them. And here we have a crucial problem with the electronic channel. But that is only one part of what we need to secure. We also need to secure all the different elements that also Liisa and President Ilves and Marietje were mentioning beforehand, that we actually need to look at all steps of the electoral process and to really protect it. And of course, in particular, in a pandemic that we have ongoing today, we really have a choice between the good, kind of like the sanitizing of our polling stations, the bad, meaning to switch immediately over to postal voting, which might be not in a sufficient way build up or having the necessary trust unless you have done that for the past 30 years, like in Switzerland. Or you need to rush to introduce internet voting, which in particular the Estonian experience has shown that you need several years to prepare credibly the internet voting channel. And if you look at our neighboring country, Lithuania, that tried to or had to do that because of a political war within 3 months, they actually failed to do so. So I would say we really have this choice between the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to short-term reactions. But if we have plenty of time, we can actually really solve also this issue about identifying voters, about securing their vote in an anonymous way, and finding different ways around that we have already discussed beforehand. What we want to discuss now in this session is really to look at global experiences on trying to understand how can we actually manifest and actually get a hold of this foreign interference. And I would like to start with the first intervention from Marina Kaljurand, who is currently elected to the European Parliament and in the past has actually racked up a number of experiences dealing on the one hand with the cyberspace and diplomacy on the other hand. So she has been a member to the UN Secretary General high-level panel on digital cooperation between 2018 and 19. She is currently the commissioner of the Global Commission of the Stability of Cyberspace, GCSC, that she has chaired between 2017 and 2019. Before that, she actually has served as the Estonian foreign minister and has been acting on various bodies, but also served as ambassador for Estonia to the State of Israel, Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Canada, and the United States of America. I think there is hardly anyone else that can give us such a good insight on how can we secure the cyberspace in the times of elections. Then Marina, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Robert, for a very kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here in discussion with Jan. Hi, Jan, wherever you are. And it was a pleasure to listen to the first panel, which put right questions into right frames. So I think for us, it's pretty good to continue where they stopped. But before going to international and global affairs, I'm speaking from Brussels, yeah? We are on a remote mode. I'm in the European Parliament. We are doing the voting in the European Parliament. What does it mean? It means that I receive an email, I do my ticks, I print it out, I take a photo, I send it somewhere, then I get another paper which is signed, I send it once again, and that's also called voting. Is it safe and secure? I hope so. But that's the way European Parliament is working. What is good about the present situation? I would say that the COVID crisis accelerated all digital topics, so that the digital topics are high on political agenda. And I would argue that maybe they're finally reaching the 13th or 23rd floor of any establishment, where they have finally reached the CEO level and the level of politicians. Do my colleagues in the European Parliament feel comfortable with digital topics? Not all of them. So my first thought before going international is to involve more politicians, members of parliaments, national parliaments, European Parliament, into discussions like this, to make them feel comfortable, to make them understand what we're discussing. Because I can see it even with one year experience in the European Parliament. When we start talking about digitalization, there are specific persons, the same persons appearing in all the discussions. So we should widen it. And I would say that multi-stakeholders should not be only governments, private sector, academia, IT people, but also politicians. Now on the EU level, digitalization, as I said, it's been mentioned as a priority. And when President Leiden speaks, and she mentions Green Deal, Digital Deal, I believe that it is a priority for her. So one of the questions I have is, how much resources do we have? And how able we are to cooperate among all European member states. I'll take an example of European Digital ID. At the moment we're working on the Digital Services Act in the Parliament. Digital services will never work in Europe without digital ID. European digital ID has been under discussion for now almost, 10 years. The regulations, directives in place have not been brought to life, are not implemented, are not applied properly, so that the Council in October this year, a month ago, once again called on the need of pan-European digital ID. Why don't we have it? Because there's no trust. It was mentioned by many previous speakers that we are lacking trust, but trust is something that we need very much, not only for online services, but maybe even more for offline services. Today, there are only 14 EU member states who have digital IDs in place that can be connected or that can be used for cross-border services. That's definitely not enough. Another thing I would like to say on the European level is there's lots of talk about disinformation. And as one of my Jewish friends has said, disinformation has been around as long as we have the Bible. That was my Jewish friend, so please don't quote me. But disinformation has been around. I understand that we're very critical towards big platforms, but I'd also like to recognize the work that the platforms like Facebook and Twitter have done. Can you imagine that 3 years ago, anybody would have said that US president's tweet is false or should be controlled? I would say it's a big thing. Even if the president is President Trump and you might hesitate about his tweet, but to say it publicly, please check it's disinformation, it's good. I see that President Ilves is still with us. He's on the board of Facebook, disinformation board or whatever board it's called, supervisory board, which will be looking into the incidents where platforms start checking or controlling what information they have disabled or what information they still have on their online. So I want to say that platforms have made a step. Is it enough? Sure, they can do much more, they can do more quickly, but we have to recognize what they have done already. And now going on the global level. The Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, which as Robert said, I really had the privilege to chair from 2017 to 2019, started its work in 2017. It was a year after DNC hacks. It was a year when President Obama and his administration attributed DNC hacks and took some diplomatic measures. Countermeasures against those who were behind those attacks. So, of course, one of the topics that the Global Commission discussed was elections. The very first topic we discussed was the protection of the public core of internet. The second, protection of elections. And when we were discussing it, and please remember, we had experts from Berkeley to Beijing, from Tallinn to Johannesburg. We had members from Russia, we had members from China, it was really global. And we had members from Microsoft, from industry, and I'm really happy that Jan is again with us, because Jan and his colleagues made a big impression and participated very actively in the work of the Global Commission. And when we were defining the norm on non-interference with electoral systems, we had a discussion. Should we limit it to democratic elections or not? Should we tell from the very beginning Russian and Chinese colleagues, we are not talking about your elections. We want a norm which concerns only democratic elections. In the end, we phrased it in the way that we do not make difference between democratic or non-democratic elections. So we just called state and non-state actors not to pursue, support, or allow cyber operations intended to disrupt the technical infrastructure essential for elections, referenda, or plebiscites. That was the norm. Why did we do the norm? There is international law out. There are other norms already out. Because we have to start talking more intensively to international community. I'm not naive. I understand that when we say free and open internet, we have different understanding in Tallinn, in Brussels, or in Beijing or Moscow. I understand that. But we already have norms in place introduced by United Nations General Assembly that were drafted by the GG group of governmental experts. We have already 13 norms. But still we thought that it's very important for our commission to say it's not okay to interfere with elections. We were not talking about disinformation. We were talking only about critical infra of elections, only purely about cybersecurity. Because if we add disinformation and information operations, difficult to agree on global arena. If we talk about interference, non-interfering with critical infra of elections, then we thought that we might receive more global attention and more global support. And at one point, it might be accepted as a rule, like money laundering. For tens of years, it took place, nobody reacted. But then at some point, it was agreed among states that it's not okay to participate in money laundering. So the aim of the norm, where the Global Commission proposed, was the same, to make it recognized by states that it's not okay to interfere with critical infra of electoral systems. And my final point. As I said, I'm not naive about United Nations. I'm not naive about global trends. Yes, they can do a lot with awareness raising, capacity building, confidence building, but the clear reaction can come from like-minded. It can come from Europe. It can come from NATO. I listened how President Ilves was critical towards NATO and the EU not doing enough in cooperation, and I agree. Cooperation can be much better. But let me remind that EU is 27. When we talk about foreign policy, security policy, we were not able to introduce sanctions against Lukashenko for a month. Because these are different countries, these are different backgrounds, these are different political interests. So even a small step of cooperation in the EU should be appreciated. And I think that a big step was taken summer this time, when for the first time EU imposed sanctions against cyber attacks. More specifically, for the first time it used the cyber diplomacy toolbox, which we have had now for 3 years, very concretely against 6 individuals and 3 entities who were responsible or involved in several cyber attacks, including attack against Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, also WannaCry, NotPetya, and Operation Cloudhopper. So we are not perfect. We are doing something on regional level. We have to do much more. And yes, Robert, I'll stop here and look forward to Jan's remarks and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, for this great intervention. And actually, you have already built a bridge very nicely for me to introduce Jan Neutze, who is the current Senior Director for Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft, where he's also leading the Defending Democracy program, where he works to advance policy and technical solutions to defend against election interference and disinformation. Jan joined Microsoft in 2011, and he has served in a range of policy and strategy leadership roles in Europe and the US. And he's including leading Microsoft's security policy team in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which was based in Brussels, and the work of Microsoft on cyber conflict as part of the company's Trustworthy Computing Initiative in Redmond, Washington. So he has also served as a number of advisory roles on tech policy issues, such as co-chair of the Global Future Council on Cybersecurity of the World Economic Forum, and as an advisor to the Partnership on Countering Foreign Influence Operations of the Carnegie Endowment, and as a board member of the Global Commission on Cyber Stability. So before joining Microsoft, he came from the United Nations headquarters, where he served for 3 years in the UN Secretary General's Executive Office and the Department of Political Affairs. So Jan, I'm looking forward to hearing from you about the efforts that you and Microsoft are doing in the area of democracy, where it normally would not be so much expected to be acting on. So maybe you can also highlight why that is the case.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this excellent discussion and important and timely conference. It's an honor and a pleasure to share the panel with Minister Kaljurand. Marina, it's wonderful to see you, as well as President Ilves and all the other speakers, of course. Let me maybe start out by outlining some of the work that Microsoft has been doing in this space, and specifically really the work of the Defending Democracy program, which I have the privilege of leading. We started this program in early 2018. So we're coming up to our 2.5, almost 3-year mark, really with the core belief that technology companies have a responsibility to help protect our democratic processes and institutions globally from cyber-enabled threats. A large part of why we believe we have this responsibility and why we're engaging, to address your question, Robert, where we're engaging in these issues and try to offer solutions, stem from the fact that we want customers, voters, citizens around the world to trust in technology. And technology, we've seen time and again, can be a double-edged sword. Technology can be exploited by bad actors out there, including, as we heard in the first panel, to undermine both the integrity of elections, potentially alter the outcome of elections, but also to undermine the trust in the entire electoral process. And so what we want to do is quite the opposite, and that is to leverage both technology and policy solutions to try and strengthen the resilience of democratic processes and institutions. And as part of the work of our program, we do that principally across 3 pillars. First, we are working to protect political campaigns, but also many other actors in the democratic space, such as journalists, human rights defenders, and others, to protect them from hacking through enhancing their resilience, to enhance cyber threat monitoring, but also through education and training, and really giving them access to security tools that they may otherwise not be able to properly leverage or afford, frankly. Some of these are solutions that Fortune 500 companies would use, and we try to make them available for either at discounted pricing or for free in many cases to those very important democratic stakeholders, because we again think that there is a key gap that needs to be addressed where these stakeholders are up against oftentimes nation state actors who have vast resources and determination to undermine the ability of those actors to participate in the democratic process. The second pillar then is focused on election integrity, and that really is about exploring solutions to safeguard the integrity of the voting process. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the things that we're doing in that space, and that is a technology we call Election Guard. More on that in a moment. And then the third pillar relates to our work on disinformation defense, and that's something that we are doing both directly as Microsoft, where we're trying to put forward analysis, but also some tools to help voters be more resilient when it comes to engaging, for example, with a very diverse and complex media ecosystem. So one core tenet of that work is focused on strengthening digital and media literacy. But it's also to focus computational propaganda and junk news by strengthening third-party efforts, whether it is the work that's going on in academic contexts. For example, Princeton University has done some groundbreaking research on computational propaganda, as has the Oxford Internet Institute. And so really trying to turbocharge those efforts by supporting them with our resources. So that's a very brief overview of the mission and the work of our program. What I might add at the outset is our mission is focused to defend elections in democratic countries. I think President Ilves made a really important point. We are squarely focused on working in the 75 or so democracies around the world. Obviously, that is where we believe elections have a fundamental role to play as part of democratic societies. We have engaged to date in about, I want to say, 40 or so countries. We're hoping to eventually get to all 75 democracies. And we're doing this really in a mix of different programmatic ways. One of the things I might point out is we have a program that we launched called Account Guard. And what Account Guard does is it provides, it's a free service that provides special monitoring for political campaigns, but also many of the other groups I mentioned, against nation state, both probing and hacking. which allows those campaigns to opt into this program and enroll both their organizational accounts as well as their personal email accounts, which in the context of a campaign is very important actually, because you oftentimes are dealing with a situation where a campaign springs up almost like a startup, and they very quickly have to scale their IT infrastructure. Oftentimes they don't necessarily have the resources to do that. And so they rely a lot on personal IT infrastructure, on volunteers, on family members. And so it becomes a very diverse ecosystem from an IT perspective, which oftentimes is much easier to exploit by nation-state actors. And then that leads to the type of hack and leak scenarios that we've seen in previous years. And so what we're hoping to do with Account Guard is to both provide the technology, but also the training and the awareness that is needed to, in fact, be able to set up a political campaign operation from a technical perspective in a way that it's most resilient and most secure. We rolled this program out in advance of the midterm elections in the US in the summer of 2018, and we've since expanded it to over 30 democracies, including the majority of countries in the European Union. A second highlight, I think, of something that we've been working on that I think is interesting and relevant in particular, not just to the US, but also potentially to a number of European countries, is in the election integrity bucket. And I mentioned it earlier, and that is what we call our Election Guard service. Election Guard is something that goes back to research done in Microsoft Research for the last 30 years, actually, by somebody named Josh Benalow, who has been researching election security and wrote his doctoral dissertation, actually, in the 1980s about end-to-end verifiable elections, something that I think many folks in Estonia might know something about. What we have come across and what we find is that the technical implementation of truly end-to-end verifiable elections had been researched and had been written about, but had never truly been implemented. And so what we went ahead and did is working with a number of partners to develop some open source technology that's freely available on GitHub, which provides for this end-to-end verifiable elections, meaning it allows for, you can think about it as a comprehensive public audit of the entire election tally when and if Election Guard is integrated into an existing voting system. What that allows is that each voter can essentially verify that their vote was counted as cast. The way that happens is that Election Guard uses what's called homomorphic encryption, a form of encryption that allows the tallying, meaning the addition of votes when they are individually encrypted, so nobody can see who a voter voted for to preserve privacy. And it provides the voter a tracking code on a piece of paper that they get to take home after they voted. And on that tracking code, or with that tracking code, they can go to a public website to see some metadata about their vote, including where they voted and when they voted. And it ensures that way that you have this public record about their vote being included in the final tally without it having been modified in any way. So again, this is a system that the concept of end-to-end verifiability has been around for a very long time. It's the first time we believe it's been actually implemented, and we've since run a successful pilot election very deliberately in a very small setting in a small jurisdiction in Wisconsin in the United States earlier this year, where we had 400 votes being cast and tallied. And the way the system worked in that instance is that we used Election Guard as the backup mechanism to provide the auditing, but the election also included a paper record, which we think is a best practice. And so having both a paper record and end-to-end verifiable technology, we believe, is a best practice that can fundamentally strengthen the trustworthiness and the outcome and strengthen a voter's confidence that their vote has been counted as cast. There's a couple of examples of what we've been working on. I'll close just by talking very briefly about what Marina covered, and that is there is both the technology aspect, but there very much also is an important policy and geostrategic conversation to be had about electoral interference. And one of the things that for a long time our team at Microsoft has been focused on is to help strengthen the global understanding of what type of norms and what type of rules of the road apply in this space. Marina mentioned the important, really groundbreaking work of the Global Commission on Cyber Stability in that regard. I would add a couple more examples to that. The norm that the Commission proposed was ultimately included in what is called the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which was adopted and has been endorsed by over 75 governments and over 1,000 organizations really from around the world, very much a multi-stakeholder effort. It's also since been reiterated and strengthened by a somewhat newer effort called the Oxford process run by Oxford University, where they've brought together international lawyers from around the world to examine how international law applies to cyberspace. And they recently published a statement on the duty of states to not only not interfere in electoral processes, but also to help defend against such the duty to help defend against such interference. And I encourage the viewers to take a look at both the Paris Call and the Oxford Process statement, which I think are important reference points to try and move the global conversation forward about what are the expectations and what is appropriate behavior when it comes to defending against electoral interference. So maybe some food for thought there. I'll stop and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for your intervention. I think you nicely highlighted how Microsoft actually has the expertise with your dear colleague, Josh Benalow, who is also a dear friend and colleague of Lisa and mine, that we've worked around the EVOD ID conference in the past. And so really this concept of end-to-end verifiability is really an important one that has been picked up in different ways in different countries and different elections, including the Estonian one. But I would like to go back to the point that you also highlighted at the end, and also that Marina was telling us a bit more about before, about this need for a global norm or a possibility to go into having kind of like something which we could say maybe an extension of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which in the end is still to date the legal text that allows us to understand what do we mean by electoral standards. And so do we need to expand it, or at which point will we actually get to an international law document of a similar value as the ICCPR, or is that, as some colleagues say, actually something which we should never achieve, because we just need to interpret the existing instruments that we have, like with tools that you had before with the cyber diplomacy toolbox, or with discussions around the Paris Call or the Oxford process. And so is that actually a wishful thing? Maybe Marina and then Jan.
Yes, thank you, Robert. My brief answer is ICCPR applies to both online and offline world. Yes, the point is there that international law was written mainly before internet was invented. That's true. But again, the firm understanding, I would say, of majority of democratic community at least, is to look into existing international law, what we have today. Look into that and look at the ways of interpreting and applying it. I do not exclude that at some point we might need either new provisions or new pieces of international law, do not exclude. But today is far too early to say, I would argue. Because how does the state practice evolve? It evolves through application of international law by nation states. We do not have many examples today. Just a couple of states have issued their opinions of their legal advisors or the State Departments or government. There haven't been serious discussions in the Security Council. Yes, there was one started by Estonia as a non-permanent member, but it was like repeating our positions that we know for years already. So I would argue we have not had different discussions. And my feeling is that in some cases, let's say even big states or big players do not want the very clear picture, what is allowed and what is not. On the other hand, I also sometimes have the feeling that those who do not want to apply international law to cyber are interested in having grey zones. And grey zones are the worst that can happen to any ecosystem. That's the reason why it was able to do cyber attacks in Ukraine just by Russia playing on the limits, what is allowed, what's not, when the reaction from international community will follow, what will be that reaction. So that's why, yes, we need clear picture, clear understanding what is allowed, what is not. We have to start with existing international law. We need legal advisors of ministries, departments to look into applicability of international law. And as I said, do not exclude that at some point we might consider new pieces of international law. As long as we don't have them, we need also political norms. Well, I'm a lawyer by education. I very well understand the difference between international law and political norms that are not legally binding, but they are political statements, that we adhere to those principles, we value those principles, we are going to live according to those principles. And that's why the norms that have been proposed so far by all the bodies we have mentioned already, but I will emphasize the GGE, because those norms have been adopted by the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, which means that all the members of the United Nations should have them as their example of behavior, of responsible state behavior. So we have to have the norms, and through norms we might evolve. We might come to new pieces of international law. And what I forgot to say earlier, but what I also like to underline is that international community is changing. This year we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And never before has there been a declaration on cooperation and security of cyberspace. In this declaration, there was not a big part, but it was mentioned. And it is a big thing that in the United Nations globally, we are thinking about stability and safety of cyberspace. Again, I repeat now the third time, I'm not naive. And I understand that globally we can do only some limited things, but we have to continue the global dialogue, and we have to go forward with application of international law, with interpretation of international law, mainly with a group of like-minded. And we should not keep it a closed group. It should be open to everybody who shares the same values and principles as the like-minded, the democratic countries do.
Okay, thank you, Marina, for these elaborations. Jan, do you share Marina's views?
I do actually, and I think Marina really summarized it very well. It is we're currently still living in a situation where there is growing understanding of how international law applies, but there are still some differences clearly in the international community about where exactly those boundaries lie. And so in the absence of a more comprehensive and really ultimately global understanding, developing norms and focusing on their implementation and application is incredibly important. And so there are different legs to the stool, if you will, that all need to be advanced simultaneously. I'll come back again to why I think the work, in particular, the recent work of the group at Oxford is so important, because the whole mandate and mission there has been, as I understand it, to look at international law as it is today, and from that derive principles about how it should be applied. And when you look at the statement that they put out a few weeks ago on international law protections against foreign electoral interference through cyber means, it really does articulate a very substantive understanding of what international law provides today. Could there be an evolution over time where this understanding is then translated into, for example, a dedicated legal instrument? Absolutely, we've seen that in other parts and other substantive areas. When we think about, for example, terrorism or other many other aspects of security policy. But Marina is right. I think we need to put in place the building blocks to, over time, get to that global understanding, and then hopefully come to a place where we have this global consensus and ultimately greater stability. Because one thing is clear: the current situation is fairly far from stable. We have many actors in this space who have discovered that using cyber means is a very cost-effective, low barrier of entry way to meddle in the affairs of another state. And democracies clearly are at an outsized risk here, again, as President Ilves outlined earlier, since they are the ones who are organizing open, free, and fair elections and having these processes targeted, be it through cyber means or through disinformation or what most of us, I think, are worried about, or many of us are worried about, a combination of both. It continues to be a huge challenge. It will continue to be a challenge, even if we didn't see significant interference. And this is something we can confirm from our end. We did not see significant foreign interference in the U.S. elections on November 3rd. And we're convinced that this is an issue that will continue to be a challenge and that we all need to guard against going forward.
I would like to come back to the US directly, because back in 2016 and with the US presidential election, that interference has actually been clearly attributed to the Russian Federation, and likewise also around the cyber attacks, which actually started the debate around cybersecurity with the Estonian basic denial of service attack on Estonian infrastructure. So why is attribution so important in cyber attacks, and including with those international norms? And why is it so difficult to act upon it, right? So, I mean, and that links then to our discussion from before on getting that global norm. Whoever would like to answer first. As that was a question actually for the audience, and so I forgot to mention that if you want to have additional questions, then please put them into the Q&A tool.
Okay, I'll start. But before going to the question, I just wanted to say that what Jan said is very right. We have the Oxford process, we have the Tallinn manual, we have academia looking into applicability of international law. That part is being done, and I think it's done well. But I still would like to emphasize what's missing is the government's part, because only states and governments can apply international law, which means that academia can do many things, but if it's not applied, and if not governments that have decided how do they interpret what academia is proposing, it won't change anything. So we need very strong commitment on application and implementation by governments, and we need state practice to see how it works in practice. On attribution, I'm a very strong believer in attribution, because attribution is a very clear signal. What is allowed, what is not, who are the bad guys, what should we do with them, to put it very simply. And attribution is always difficult. It's not like the Agatha Christie where you have the gun and you have the body. In cyber, it's maybe comparable to the Skripal case, where there are many hypothetical. You have to convince your partners that you have enough information. You have to be very clear with how much of information you disclose, because you can't disclose all the way of attribution, not jeopardizing yourself. So it's complicated, I get it, but it's still doable. It's doable on technical level, on legal level, and on political level. All those levels have to be included. Maybe the most difficult one I'm not an IT geek, but I think that the political level is maybe even more difficult. Because we have the technical level attributions, and lawyers can say that yes, it's against international law, but then comes the political level. Once you attribute, you have to understand that there will be measures against you. It's like diplomacy. Once you expel diplomats, your diplomats will be expelled. It's happening in real world, so attribution always has some negative results for those who are brave enough to attribute. And maybe that's why I very much appreciate what EU has done so far with the collective attribution. 27 countries, even if the wording is not very strong one, and even if the wording could have been much better, it's a big thing. 27 states said that these persons, these entities are behind those attacks, and we take measures. We introduce sanctions against them. So with the attribution, with countermeasures, we clarify the picture and we make the rules more understandable to everybody. Don't mess with us, or these things will happen to you.
I might add to that, Marina, by I think underlining what I think is important, and that is attribution in and of itself is not the goal. The goal is accountability, right? And attribution is one way to get to greater accountability in cyberspace, which is something that I think all of us who've been working in this space are really hoping to help progress. And attribution is one key piece of this, and I would just confirm what Marina said. There have been significant amounts of progress made when it comes to the ability to attribute cyber attacks to nation-state actors. At Microsoft, we have a dedicated team that does this day in and day out. They're called the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, or MISTIC by their abbreviation. They are at this point tracking over 50 nation-state actors around the clock, 365 days out of the year, building threat profiles and really tracking their different operations in countries around the world, impacting our customers, and then in cooperation with many others in industry and in government, also beyond just our customer base. And so it is a concerning trend, but we are able to, in many cases, attribute with high confidence certain targeting and certain to remain vigilant. Attribution is a key tool, but ultimately we need to get to this much broader set of accountability, and that includes what Marina mentioned. That's countermeasures, it can be sanctions and other things, and the EU certainly has been a leader on these aspects through the toolbox and other policy measures.
Great. I would like to come to the last topic and combine basically those two interventions that we have in our Q&A and with your final words. I mean, as you both are kind of external to the Estonian electoral process, I would like to just give you these two questions. So which other countries have approached the Estonian government about its iVoting platform? How are we still the only country in the EU that allows online voting, even though the European Commission, and I'm not sure that it actually is the European Commission that has accepted it, is clearly fine with Estonia using it for EP elections? And then the second question, is there any future for internet voting globally due to ICT, further development and COVID situation? So, I mean, Marina, you highlighted before how the European Parliament is voting. Wouldn't that be time that they use a more secure version? And just very brief, as we only have very limited time before I give back to Merle.
Okay, sorry, I'll go first again very briefly. Are other countries interested in Estonia's experience? I remember that before the parliamentary elections and European Parliament elections in 2019, we had about 100 delegations visiting e-Estonia iVoting Center, which means that there is huge interest. When countries are ready to do that, you need three components. First of all, you need laws and regulations in place. It means digital ID. You need services that are safe and secure, and most important, you need political will. As long as you don't have these three components, you will not be able to do that. Does the European Parliament recognize it as a safe and secure? They have to, because elections so far are in the hands of nation states. There have been the analysis have taken place, and nobody has proved that Estonian online voting is less secure than offline voting taking place in other countries. And of course, there are risks, they have to be mitigated. And my final word on European Parliament, I'm not saying that it's not secure what we're doing. It's just very bureaucratic, it's just very difficult, it takes lots of time, it's not efficient. But yes, I'm not putting into the question security of the European Parliament voting at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks for those questions, Robert, and to the audience. I think they're incredibly important questions. And I also want to say I don't think we necessarily have all the answers yet, certainly when it comes to the question of what does the future of internet voting look like. What I can say is that at the end of the day, just like paper is not a goal, paper is a medium, internet voting may not be a goal, it may just be a medium. And so the question is, how can we organize voting in the most safe and secure process? Given everything we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that we've seen digitization, sort of 5 years worth of digitization happening in more or less 5 months, I would strongly suspect that we may see an impact also on how elections are being conducted in terms of the use of digital technology. And that may lead to a broader application of internet-based voting. What I want to say, though, is, and I want to be really clear, we have been very cautious from a Microsoft perspective about how to approach this issue. We think it merits further study, and certainly would believe that if internet voting is developed and deployed more broadly, it needs proper guardrails. Estonia has a lot of experience and expertise on this issue, which I think is extremely relevant for other democracies around the world. So I'm not surprised by the level of interest that Marina just described. I've had a chance to visit some of the Estonian institutions working on this, and I remember seeing a large map indicating where all these visitors were coming from, and it really highlights, I think, how this interest is global. And so you have a lot to share with others based on your experience. And so I think we need to take the best of what Estonia has developed and maybe think about what other guardrails exist, whether it is end-to-end verifiable technology or other technologies. But I would just suggest that when we look at all the other aspects of how technology is being deployed and how that deployment is accelerated in the context of this pandemic, I'm sure we can make some progress, and there will be demand for exploring what more can be done in this space. And we're certainly open to having that conversation, but we also want to be really measured and cautious when we do.
Thank you, Jan and Marina, for those great interventions. I think it has clearly shown us that on the one hand side, we need to have those global norms to help us actually govern this election interference more effectively, right? And on the other hand, we also need to get a better understanding of the technology and how to actually make everyone believe that it's working properly, because that is also an important element of this. And the other hand, if we don't get a good understanding of how to do also things like elections during a pandemic where we all work from home, we might all get caught off guarded and have to live with an insecure solution or not as secure as it could be if we do our homework. With that, I would like to hand over to Merge for the further proceedings of this conference. Thank you again, Marina and Jan. It was a great discussion with you.
Robert, Professor Krimmer, thank you very much for moderating the second panel, and thank you, Jan Neutze, thank you, Marina Kaljurand, for a really exciting discussion. As a way of summing up, I'd like to paraphrase Leo Tolstoy in the opening of Anna Karenina, whereas All democratic nations are alike in organizing elections, in renewing representation in their parliamentary or local government assemblies. Yet, all these nations vary in ways the elections are being carried out. Today, we've been reminded that almost all election procedures use some forms of technology, be it political campaigns, in the voter registration, or vote tabulation and later online publication of the results. We've been reminded how deeply important trust in electoral processes is, how it is closely linked with being transparent, how in this transparency and communication to the wider audience, there is a key role in politicians, but also there is a big role in the private sector. For many election officials across the globe, the COVID pandemic has prompted to review their own systems, looking for innovative solutions to ensure resilience in their voting process and shoring themselves against integrity risks. I'm really proud that e-Governance Academy has been able to add its 2 cents into the discussion on this issue today. And I would really like to thank our supporters in this endeavor, the Estonian State Election Office, the CybExer Technologies, Konrad-Adenauer Fund, and Microsoft. However, in this modern era of organizing discussions digitally, I think it's enough to have you speaker, have you listeners just listen. Now time has come to participate. So as we've come to a conclusion of our 2 panel discussions, I would encourage everybody who's registered to participate in the tabletop exercise to come back to the workplace environment after a short break of about 15 minutes, and then you will find a link that will take you to the tabletop exercise where you can all together practice your approach to the innovative solutions to provide election security on your own. Test out your thoughts, test out your skills in cooperation with the CybExer Technologies, where the tabletop exercise will continue on their strategic online platform called Stratex. So I encourage everybody to take a short break and return in about 15 minutes, where the discussion and the tabletop exercise part of today's conference continues. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.